Okay, welcome back to another exciting episode of Broadcast Team Alpha. We've got an exciting guest with us today, Robert Morningstar. Robert is a well-known JFK researcher. He's an expert on Tai Chi, and he's got some very insightful things to say about consciousness, which is one of the reasons why we have him today on the show. Augie, how are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful. And let me talk a little more about Robert. He's one of the great wells of knowledge and wisdom, and we are definitely going to the well today to learn some more. Robert has been studying what is behind the curtain and been pulling the curtain aside for everybody to see what's back there for well over 30, 40 years now. And for those of you that wonder what we will be talking about, well, I don't know. Because Robert can speak on absolutely anything and go anywhere within the arena that is outside of the box. There is so much on his bio, so I would rather have him say what's more important for us to know. Robert, the floor is yours, and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for your kind words. I greatly appreciate them, and I greatly appreciate being here on the show. You invited me to talk about consciousness, and so I prepared for that, but we can go anywhere. And you also mentioned the JFK assassination and my expertise in Tai Chi Chuan, and they all have worked together to bring me to this point, which is to talk about how my consciousness was expanded through various modalities that I pursued. I'd like to say that since childhood I had psychic abilities, and my entire family had psychic abilities, and we took it for granted that is the natural state of human beings. But then I and others were perplexed as to why science was in such denial of the paranormal, and why other people didn't have it or disbelieved in it. And as time went by, I realized that human consciousness has been hijacked in many ways. And you say out of the box and inside the box. Well, the human consciousness has been put inside the box. And I would like to say that I have a program called The Sounds of New York City News, and right now you're hearing in the background why it's called The Sounds of New York City News. Compliments of the New York City Fire Department, Police Department, the ambulances. But that being said, everything you hear in the background is real. It's not special effects. And as I say, you can't buy these special effects for $1 million. But to get back to the point, consciousness. We are all endowed by our Creator with a spark of consciousness which is identical with the Creator. And by that I mean to express the theory of Carl Jung, who said that at the beginning of time, well, basically, let me put it this way. He didn't say it in these words, but God blew his mind, and his consciousness, God's consciousness, exploded throughout the universe, and the consciousness was abundant but separated, and consciousness started to aggregate a molecular structure that it adhered to, and that through that process consciousness and matter melded, and the process of the evolution of humankind and every other kind of conscious being began. The Gnostics called that agency of the conscious creation of the universe Sophia, or Holy Wisdom, and she's considered the spouse of God. Mysticism is very deep, and the language seems very alien to people who are steeped in science and the concrete. And those people I consider to be in jail, a self-imposed prison that creates a material universe around them which denies all aspects of spirituality. And I think that is very much like being in hell on earth.
Robert, you mentioned the Gnostics. Tell us a little bit about that. I think there's kind of been a resurgence in Gnosticism. People are starting to kind of rediscover that these texts have a parallel history to the Dead Sea Scrolls, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely. And that's one of the great fortunes that I've had, is that I learned about the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1960 when I was 12 years old. And for the rest of my life, I've followed the evolution of the theories and the little snippets that were being leaked out while the Israeli government suppressed the entire scrolls, and the controversy that evolved. But I also in, let me see, this was 1984, I came across the first publication of the Nag Hammadi library. And this is what you're referring to.
Yeah, exactly.
That gave us the insight into what was believed by early Christians and various sects in the Hellenistic world. And it dealt with the creation of the universe by a group of beings called the Archons. And the Archons are beings who really despise human beings because we have usurped what they believe is their right. God created man after the Archons, and the Archons resist mankind and mankind's evolution and mankind's very existence. And so they are, you can think of them as predators and leeches who delight in stealing our soul powers and our spiritual energies and putting us into negative psychological states which feed their strength. They are invisible, but they can act in the material world either through mental influences, let's say telepathy, put a bad idea in a person's mind that the person thinks is his own idea, for example, and they spread evil and chaos for the most part. And people say, oh, what is evil? Because of moral relativism, people have gotten very fuzzy on the nature of good and evil.
That's
and
very
they
true.
say they think it's all relative, but I don't believe that.
Well, there's also in the Gnostic texts, there's also a little bit different Jesus is portrayed in those texts as well, a little bit more mystical. And also, I think some of the history behind some of it, from what I've read, that some of the texts actually predate, or not predate, but they actually show up a little earlier than when people talk about the New Testament or the Council of Nicaea, that some of these texts actually predate, that are actually earlier than some of those texts, I believe.
Yes, and some of the Gospels may have drawn from them.
Right,
that's
right.
the thing. But this is what was popularly known. The Greeks, like we're talking about Jesus in his time, the Greeks had already been around for 500 years. In 500 years you can learn a lot and deduce a lot and come to a great understanding of reality. Right? After all, it was the Greeks that invented science. It was Aristotle who invented science. And so they had insight into these demons. People call them demons sometimes. And the Archons are at war with humanity, and they are trying to subvert us and deflect us and distract us and hijack our consciousness to keep it in the box, to limit it. And so it is quite an ordeal for human beings to find their true nature, because the nature that we wear today is one that's been conditioned, especially in the last 55 years. It's like a mass hijacking of human consciousness that began precisely with the assassination of President Kennedy. That was when mass media had become so well developed that they were able to twist the facts, filter them out, and produce the Warren Commission report, which is one of the worst things this country ever experienced, because the Warren Commission report perverted science, it perverted law, and it perverted medicine. The rigging of the autopsy report, the faking of the autopsy report, hijacked medicine to the purposes of government. Law.
Wasn't there a lot of Madison Avenue advertising? There was a guy, I forget his name, I know you know who I'm talking about, that really kind of discovered and became kind of the evil genius behind advertising. He realized how influential it could be to manipulate the masses towards,
Yes.
I forget the gentleman's name.
Well, I do know it. I know you're thinking of one, but you're thinking of Bernays.
That's it. That's it.
But he was secondary. I had the privilege of being a Tai Chi teacher to a wonderful lady whose name was Mrs. Alice Esty. And when I got to know her, she told me who she was. She was the wife of William Esty, who established the William Esty advertising agency in New York. And what he was in World War I was an officer in the U.S. Army, and he was with psychological warfare, and using psychological warfare to try to defeat the Germans. After the war, he came back to the United States, and he decided that what he was going to do was apply all of these principles of psychological warfare that he had learned during World War I to what became known as advertising.
Or propaganda.
Yeah, he used propaganda. He took the propaganda and turned it into advertising.
Right.
And Mr. Esty was the person who began to enlist doctors and actors and actresses to endorse products. And he enlisted doctors to endorse cigarettes and things like that, and convince people, and women in particular. Women were targeted, that smoking was a sign of freedom and liberation and equality. So that was one of his claims.
How did we get so gullible back then? And why? And
well, people were naive and credulous. There is a power in media, especially in film, to depict something with such stark reality that you take it for reality and you keep forgetting it's an illusion. True. It's contrived. And the same applies to print media. A person can tell you something, or a many number of people can tell you something, and you hear it and you gestate it and you take it or leave it. But it seems that humanity is prone to falling for the printed text. Once you see the big lie printed in a newspaper, in a book, depicted on television, somehow it takes on a greater aura of reality, when in fact it may be a greater lie and a greater deception than what the true reality is. Case in point, the JFK assassination, how they covered up every aspect of the plot to kill the president. And they were able to twist the facts to frame an innocent man who was actually in Dallas trying to save the president and did his best to save the president. And in fact, Lee Oswald sent a telegram on November 20th to all FBI offices in the United States, trying to warn them that there was a plot to assassinate the president on November 22nd, 1963. J. Edgar Hoover removed every single copy of that telegram from every office, but there was one that was kept in his files and in the FBI. Well, that was released last year, and I found it. I have a psychic gift in research. As I often like to say, God moves the mouse, and I only click it. I swear to God, I do believe that. It's a psychic thing. It's uncanny.
But back to this thing about consciousness, though, that we're trying to focus on. How did we get to a place in our society where we gave up our critical thinking skills and didn't question? We became unquestioning, and so when the big voices spoke, people listened. We didn't have, it seemed like, the tools to discern or to reject outright falsehoods that cigarette smoking could be good for you, that we would actually, that our society would actually buy into some of this stuff, and we're still buying into a lot of untruths.
Well, I think it has to do with education, intentionally hijacking educational, the syllabus. They started to teach differently and limitedly. I was speaking today to Reverend Michael Halford, who's been on my show many times, about how the language, I keep talking about hijacking, it really is, it's a hijacking and abduction of people's awareness, but the vocabulary of the average American has been reduced radically by the manipulation of education and Common Core curriculum, so that now in the general media and generally in newspapers, the vocabulary is limited to about 5,000 words. And that is one way of, it's kind of like a lobotomy. Do you remember in 2001 A Space Odyssey where the computer turned against the astronauts and he had to disable it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
He disabled everything except what was necessary to maintain the
ship's functions.
The ship's functions. And so what he disabled were logic functions and memory. And remember, he's saying, I'm losing my memory. And then he goes back, he regresses to where the computer was being programmed by Dr. Chandra at the University of Illinois at Urbana. And he starts singing Daisy, Daisy.
Exactly.
Remember?
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's an analog to what has happened to American consciousness through the manipulation of education. Fortunately, for me and Agnos and probably you, we were raised in a time when we were following the old curriculum. And what is the old curriculum? The old curriculum is one where a person, in a high school student in 1900, had to pass tests that high school graduates and even college graduates don't seem to be able to pass these days. You know, mathematics.
Oh, absolutely. I agree totally.
And vocabularies. And so I believe that's the main reason the whole population has been dumbed down by the democratic process, you know.
Well, also, I think the ability to question and do critical thinking, to actually engage with other people in a civil way about disagreeing, or what we call dispassionate discourse or dispassionate debate, where you can argue a point in a logical way and you don't walk away bloody, you actually walk away kind of enlightened, where you learn something from the other party and you say, okay, well, I still don't agree with you, but thank you for showing me what you just showed me. We don't seem to be able to do that much anymore. It seems to be a very rare occasion now.
Yeah, we all know that, and the mind seems to be a very pliable thing, and it's becoming obvious to me that I'm going to bring it back to what we were talking about consciousness, and that is that we're not just flesh, bones, and hangnails, but we are much more than that. And maybe, Robert, you could also speak a little bit to the consciousness, actually. What is it? We have this spark of life that is being individualized, so it appears as we are separate, but under the ground we are one with all consciousness. And I would like for you to maybe talk a little more on that, because once we start understanding how we are, that is the key to the door to get out of that prison we are in.
Well, I think the main prison is the identification of the individual's self with the body, rather than with consciousness and awareness. Before you can claim the body, you have to be awake and aware. Now, consciousness is a general principle of awareness from the Godhead. And you can be unconscious, and you can be conscious, and you can be conscious but not aware. And by that I mean paying attention to the world around you, which is fed to your brain by your senses. And we confuse the hologram that is being projected into our brains as the reality, when they are actually a disturbance. It's wave functions that create differentiation between inside and outside of the body. And so you have to understand that you can be conscious but not aware. And if you are aware, you can be even more aware when you're concentrated. So I talk about consciousness in terms of the bullseye, right? The outside of the bullseye is the universe. The first ring around the bullseye, the big ring, is consciousness. The second ring is awareness, and the dot, the bullseye itself, is concentration. And you have to learn to concentrate, because if you don't learn how to concentrate, your awareness can be hijacked, deflected, distracted, deceived, all of which are applicable to the Zapruder film. I mean, not just the Zapruder film, the Warren Commission report.
I also see that up to about now, there is many scientists that say, well, there's no evidence of consciousness, but because everything happens in the brain. Well, the brain is probably the gate into the physical existence from consciousness. So what do you see actually being the difference between the brain and the consciousness?
The brain provides one aspect of consciousness, but the brain cannot exist without the heart.
Yeah.
Say that. And the heart thinking. You know, in Chinese, the word xin means heart, and it's also part of the character for thinking. And there's a thinking that comes from the heart, there's a thinking that comes from the gut, and there's a thinking that comes from the brain, and specifically the left side of the brain where the verbal center is dominant. And when the verbal center is dominant, you are neglecting about 90% of the other faculties which reside in the right hemisphere and in the cerebellum, and then in every part of your brain there is a different aspect of consciousness and awareness. But you have to explore your own brain, and you have to delve in deeply into its components, its faculties.
Yeah.
And understand that the purpose of having a brain is to integrate all of these faculties and all of the senses and to make sense of the world.
Mm-hmm. You know, you mentioned the word Qi. I also know that you are a Tai Chi master. And maybe we could go on to a different subject here by also talking a little bit about martial arts, Tai Chi, and there's some phenomenal health benefits in there, and actually through the mind disciplines that is taught through Tai Chi and the martial arts, there's some phenomenal abilities that is coming to the surface, and we can do amazing things.
Yes, indeed. Well, Qi is a fundamental energy of life. That's the description. Qi in Chinese literally means steam. So while we're alive, we have this steam, a living steam circulating through us, maintaining our lives and maintaining, repairing, restoring. And when we die, we lose it. That's why a body, a corpse is cold, dead, rigid, inert. So the Qi is the life force. It proceeds from something called Jing, and which is the sexual generative force. It's transformed into Qi, and then the higher level, we're talking now about Taoist alchemy, the evolution of human consciousness from the material, the Jing, to the Qi, which is metaphysical, to the Shen, which is spiritual. The Shen means spirit. Yeah. So the process involved in Tai Chi is a very profound system of alchemy where you harness your generative force in a center in the lower body called the Dantian. This literally means the carnation field, and carnation is used as a symbol of consciousness. So you plant the seed of the carnation, your consciousness in your Dantian, which is about an inch below your navel, and maybe 3 inches into your body, depending on your dimensions. So 3 sections in from the front, 7 sections in from the spine. And that point, concentration point, which is where we carry our generative organs, the female womb and the male testicles connected to the kidneys, they traverse this Dantian. So you concentrate your Qi in the Dantian, feed it with the Jing, the raw sexual energy. You boil it. You boil it with your concentration, and then after this boiling process occurs, it rises and suffuses your body, something like water being absorbed by a sponge, but it's more ethereal. when this living water, which Jesus spoke about, I'll quote him a little bit later, when this living water has suffused every membrane and every cell in your body, it gives birth to the spirit body, which is called the Shen. And at that time, the body can be dropped and the Shen remains. I think of it in terms of sculpture. You know, when you have a mold and you pour the, let's say whatever metal, if you were Rodin, you were pouring liquid metal into a plaster cast, and then breaking the plaster cast to reveal the sculpture. I think that analogy is fit for describing how the Shen will suffuse the entire body and give birth to your spirit. Now, if you're lucky enough to do this while you're alive, you become an immortal while you're alive, because you transfer your identity from the corporeal to the spiritual. You realize that this body is just a vehicle and an instrument given to us by Godhead, so that we can find out what it's carrying and then change our identity to the spiritual being, the soul being who is in here.
Let me run a quick one by you here. I have a theory, and I want to hear what you think of it. Even quantum physics now is coming out telling us that we live in a mind-created universe. If it is mind-created, that means there is nothing physical. It's created by the mind, which thought induced intention. And through this thought-created universe that we think we are living with and in, then everything is created by the mind. So once we start understanding what we are and what we create with our mind, we can also change our mind and change our physical so-called reality to what we want it to be by the mind. In other words, that's where maybe ascension come in. We think we're physical, but we're not. So we change our mind and we take the physical body with us and move it to a higher vibration where it belongs in the first place. And do you think there is something in there that actually I could hang my hat on?
Well, I think so, but I would say that what people take for reality, which is what they see and what they hear, they project it outside themselves. But in reality, it is a hologram that's being projected in the back of your head. Everyone listening and looking at your computer monitor or screen for this purpose, you think that that screen is outside your head, and it's not. That screen is a hologram that's being projected in the back. It's not even in front of you. It's behind you. It's in the back of your head. There's a projection room in the back of the head, in the optic lobe, and the eyes are windows to the outside. And there's, oh my goodness, there are trillions of elements of information out there. So these trillion bits of information enter your eyeballs. They follow the optic nerve. They cross at the optic chiasma, which is where they overlap and cross over, so that the right eye feeds the left side of the brain, the left eye feeds the right side of the brain, and then just behind that there is something called the lateral geniculate nucleus. And these are filters, and these two filters screen those trillions of bits of information and then allow to flow into the optic lobe what the brain thinks is essential information. So we're not seeing everything that's out here.
I got a question for you.
Yeah.
And that is, hang on, I'll turn my volume down here. Like, okay, so at what point does this mind-created universe stop? Okay, you're basically saying it stops at the body because the illusion's happening within the brain or with the optic nerves. So it's really an agreement. We're all agreeing in a giant consciousness that the planet exists, that the physical elements exist, that the computers exist. It's all a giant agreement. And so
Precisely.
And so you're even agreeing that the human body exists.
I agree with that. Here's the consensus. That's what you're talking about. We agree to use words to label things, objects, and assume that we all see them the same way.
Like flavors and smells.
Yes, like flavors and colors. Now, let us say that my eye, okay, I believe that different colored eyes produce different images in the back of people's brains, but to be the convention of language, we agree to call certain phenomena by a certain label, but there's no certainty that the phenomena that we are labeling orange, purple, red, or green is exactly the same in all our perceptions. That is to say, if let's say a person with hazel eyes sees a color that that person has been trained to call green, and another person has different color eyes that filter the spectrum and produce what the hazel-eyed person would call blue, that person sees what the hazel-eyed person would see as green, the other person sees as blue. But they always see it consistently, but they're both taught to call that color green. So the consensus is in agreeing that we are all seeing the same thing, but that is not provable. It is not. It is not certain.
Well, yeah, but
and
my point
you find this out. You find this out when you do psychedelics. Okay, when you do psychedelics, your nervous system is speeded up, and the information travels more rapidly across nerve junctions called synapses. So it's at that time when you experience a higher level of awareness in a psychedelic state that you will see that colors are variable and that it's your mind that concentrates and keeps colors in your spectrum.
I guess my point, Bob, was that it's a giant agreement, that this entire thing we call reality is a giant agreement, and that when people talk about it like you have, for you, you're very comfortable with it. So I'm kind of speaking from a perspective of the audience that might not quite get when people say that, when they're trying to understand that this is a collective agreement that we've been given to agree with since childhood, since we were babies. We were taught to agree with the illusion. This is the illusion as everybody else sees it, and that's what you need to see. And so I guess part of understanding consciousness is to understand that we also have the ability to manipulate that. And once we understand that, we begin to use our, quote, co-creative power, that we can manipulate the so-called reality to get different results, basically hacking the matrix.
Yes. The other problem is that because of these illusions and delusions, people wind up fighting over words and sounds and confusing them with the object, the real thing. Let me give you an example.
Yep.
We have an object external to ourselves. We call it a chair, right? We call it a chair in English. A Spanish person will call it silla. A Chinese person will call it Yizi. Right? Three different sounds for the same object.
Right.
Yep.
But is any one of those sounds more true than the other?
No, it's just a different. It's a different language.
It's a different consensus.
Right.
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 And I see that people really get into fights over the consensus, over the words. And I believe that people who live their lives and speak only one language are in a kind of a verbal prison. Language is a map for navigating reality. And as you know, there are a lot of different kinds of maps, topographical maps and just area maps that show borders and contours. And some maps, I think, are better than others. I have experienced 5 maps in my life, a couple more. I learned to speak English, then Spanish, then Latin, and French, German, but Chinese before German. So that's about 6 languages. So I'm familiar with all of those different maps, and I'm able to separate myself from all those maps and see reality in a nonverbal form. That's one of the main things in training in meditation. For example, the Tibetans say that the mind is like a barking dog, right? The incessant conversationalist, the one that's always chattering, talking away on the left side of your brain, hijacking the other 95%. If you're lucky enough to be using 5% of your capacities. I learned when I was a boy that even a person like Albert Einstein was only using 5 to 7% of the brain power of a human being. So I turned my attention to exploring and accessing that as much as possible of that other 95%.
And isn't that what we're finding out about our cosmic community? Is that they communicate telepathically and find our words and sounds extremely cumbersome and tedious because they communicate telepathically, and that's something that a lot of people are starting to understand they can do now. People are starting to understand their own innate gifts and begin to use these things. It's much faster than trying to grunt words.
Yeah, and you think about it this way too. How many times have you had your telephone ring and you think of somebody at the same time that you haven't thought about for 3 weeks, and then you grab the phone and they get, by golly, that's the guy calling you.
It's telepathic.
I agree. Yes.
Yeah.
You know, even Mark Twain wrote about that. There's a wonderful compilation of Mark Twain's writings, his Mark Twain's short notes and short stories, and he writes about that phenomenon that he's thinking about a person he hasn't thought about for a long time. The next day there was a letter in the mailbox from that person.
Yep.
And this is kind of the way that telepathy works, is the entire bundle of information goes all at once. So you're aware, you know it. However, language is linear.
Right.
You know?
It's limited by time-space, whereas
right,
telepathy is not limited by time-space.
Yes, and it limits us to an illusion.
It's true.
One of the illusions is that we are all living in the same time frame, and that's false. We all think that we're living in the now, right? What we call the now. And there is no now. Only a moment, a millisecond of now. Between the time I started the N in the word now and finished the W, a tremendous amount of time has passed. Now. But we all agree that we're all in the same space-time. I had an experience, a realization. Again, you know, I did psychedelics at a time when they were legal, and it expanded my consciousness. In one of those times, my partner and I got lost in space-time, and our conversations got out of sync. It's as if you had 2 tracks of a conversation, right? Question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, right? But all of a sudden you slid the tapes out of sync, and the same conversation was going, and the same answers were being given, but they were out of sync. And I realized in that moment that we are all really time travelers, and we are pretending to be traveling on the same light wave. And the way I discovered it is this. For me to communicate an idea to you, I create the idea, or I conceive the idea, and then that idea, which is immaterial, has to be transformed into neuroelectronic pulses, which flex the muscles in my larynx and create and expel the sound that disturbs the air, that propagates as a sound wave to your ear, impinges on the eardrum, and then is translated into neurological impulses that go to your brain.
It finally makes some kind of sense.
Right. So there's you know, it's like that, but it is a delay. So I'm in the future and I transmit. You receive it. When you receive it, you're in the past, because my thought is already gone. You know, my brain is on to another idea after I've disturbed the air and communicated this idea to you. So I had to be in the future relative to you to be able to receive it. Then you receive the idea, and get the conception, and then you have to return an answer. For me to receive that answer from you verbally, I have to switch modalities and go back in time, because I have to wait that time delay.
True.
My idea goes to you, you conceive it, you conceive your response. There's a delay between the time you conceive your response and innervate the nerves of your larynx, and then the sound has to propagate, cross the air between us, and hit my ear. And so I realized, we're not all in the same time frame, but we're pretending to be.
You know what even gets bigger, Robert, is I think when we look at everything we're talking up to right now is all about the land of separateness. This little experiment, we come to this planet, we incarnate here, and we're in this land of separateness. So we have to learn the separateness matrix about being individuals, about the individualness. And I think it's just a school of understanding separateness, because when you think about time, space, where it's all happening at once, and we've basically focused in on this little moment in time, we've all, like a needle dropping into a track, we're all dropped into the same track to experience this moment. But then you start looking at the bigger context where there is no separateness, back to the singularity, that as we begin to evolve up into more advanced beings, into light beings, where there's less and less separateness. It's more of a hive mind. And the barriers that we have here now, I don't believe we have as we move up.
I believe that the separateness is in the body.
Yes.
But we are all unified in spirit and in soul.
Yes, I agree with you there.
And you have to, it's really rough, for people, again, if you only speak one language, and if you've been indoctrinated in only one religion that excludes, it excludes allowance of new ideas into your mind, forbidden thoughts, the Catholic Church, the Muslims, Jews, every religion
Christians
has a
right
codex.
there with them, exactly.
It has a codex of forbidden thinking. And you have to be courageous enough to believe that you're not going to go to hell if you think this thought or explore this idea. And again, there's the fear element that is used to keep you under control. So we have to overcome fear, because fear leads to many other negative consequences. I was talking about anger. Anger generally proceeds from fear.
You mentioned also earlier, meditation, and that I found is so important, because it's a very major part of any kind of mind training and martial arts and Tai Chi, and it opens up the gate for us to get back to the universal mind, so we can start looking at our existence and get some new perspective of it. Without that meditation, it's very hard to get there.
Yes. Well, what you say is true, and the purpose of meditation is to liberate you from the ego, from the tyranny of the ego. About 25 years ago, a professor at Columbia University did brain studies, and he concluded that the ego is an illusion, and it only exists as long as the verbal centers are in this feedback loop. Like taking how you put a twist on a piece of tape and then you can put it in and like a figure 8 and play it.
Yeah, the
right?
Mobius
Like
strip.
a Mobius strip, except you always, and then of course, let's tell people about the Mobius strip, a piece of paper with only one side, and that's mind-boggling when people realize that. So again, as long as the verbal center is jabbering, talking, barking, as the Tibetans say, your ego is extant. As soon as you shut down the verbal center, you enter a silence, but that silence is not a void. That silence gives you access to all of the other faculties that are denied by the barking dog. The barking dog is there to distract you from your psychic abilities, your instinct, your intuition, your telepathy. It interferes. If you're jabbering constantly, blabbing away inside, you can't receive. You have to clear your mind, make it void.
Well, now we not only have the jabbering mind, but we have the smartphones in front of us, and the electronics, and the television, and all these other external influences that are combining with the internal jabbering. You've got the external jabbering too.
Right. Yeah, I limit my that kind of electronic jabbering to my computer. I refuse to have an iPhone or a cell phone. I've never had either one. Or maybe briefly I used one, but never put it to my head. And what I see, I talk a lot about hijacking consciousness. Oh my Lord, everyone is willingly surrendering their consciousness to this very limited space of awareness. Remember I talked about consciousness and then awareness and concentration. Well, both people's awareness and concentration is being hijacked by the gibberish that's coming across in cell phones. And I'd like to take this moment to point people to something very important. In 1999, Time magazine did an interview with Li Hongzhi, Chinese guru, a Chinese teacher of Falun Gong.
Oh,
He teaches particular forms of meditation which are very, very powerful, efficacious. And he was interviewed by Time magazine because at that time the Falun Gong had risen in China as a popular movement so rapidly that 100 million Chinese people were practicing and deriving serenity and peace and love and goodwill from these mass meditations that were happening. And the Chinese government came down really hard on them because they don't want people at peace and harmony. Communism rules by fear, and these people were becoming fearless. And that was very disturbing to them. And so they began to persecute the Falun Gong, and they're doing it to this day. And the Falun Gong people are victims of organ harvesting. I had the privilege of exposing the Chinese organ harvesting industry in 2005, but I'm not going to go into that right now. I'm going to go into Li Hongzhi and his message. Now, you know, American magazines and newspapers, they set you up. They call you in for an interview for their purpose, and then, in what they think is fair and balanced, they have to twist it and give you a little bit of a backlash. So if you find this interview in 1999, Time magazine with Li Hongzhi, the head of Falun Gong, and you read it, the first part of it is all about the political aspects of the Falun Gong movement in Red China. And then at the end, they start to ask him about what's wrong with the world. And he said, what's wrong with the world is that the world has been invaded by a group of hostile extraterrestrials, and they're trying to take over our consciousness through the use of electronic devices. 1999, you know? He's saying the ETs have transferred a technology to world governments that is facilitating their takeover of human consciousness to make human consciousness more like them. And he said, these electronic devices are computers and cell phones. There wasn't an iPhone then, he's talking about cell phones, and that each of these things that are creating a virtual reality are hijacking our consciousness from what we are entitled to, our birthrights, to an alien form of consciousness and awareness. And I had a really direct experience of it and saw the effects of it when I saw this Pokemon hunt that was very popular 2 years ago. Apple got together with the people who make Pokemon, and they had these Pokemon hunts. And they would plant Pokemon in all these different cities in different regions. And this region was Central Park, right? So I happened to come upon this very strange scene. I had met with one of my top students, Tai Chi students, and we finished our session. We decided to walk home through the park. I looked down in Central Park near this ball field, and I saw the creepiest thing I think I've ever seen. I saw 60 people clambering over rocks, all in different ways. They all had iPhones in their hands. And I looked at it, and it looked like insects. The body motion, the movements of this mass of people was not human. They looked like insects crawling, looking around for something. And I was just so curious. I went up to this first guy I saw, and I said, hey, what are you doing? Can you talk to me? And he came over, and it took me a couple of seconds to extract him from his iPhone. And when he looked at me, his eyes looked like a drug addict. He was in a delirium. He was totally intoxicated. And I said to him, "Hey, what are you doing? Are you hunting for Pokemon?" And he said, "Oh, yes." And I said, "Can I see what you're hunting for?" And he showed me his iPhone. And there was a little, I'll call it a little yellow rabbit in there. And I said, "Oh, so that's what you're hunting, and it's here in Central Park?" He said, "Yes." And I asked him, "Now, if you capture that Pokemon, do all the others disappear on the other people's cell phones?" He said, "No, they're still there." And I was amazed, and I said, "I wonder what the hell this thing is all about." So I'm walking with my lawyer, and I said, "That's one of the strangest things. Do you see them? They weren't moving like human beings. They were clambering around this rock outcrop like a bunch of ants or insects." So we walk out of the park, and I said, "I wonder what the purpose of this campaign is." So we walk by a famous ice cream store, and I look in the window, and there are wanted posters for this little yellow rabbit Pokemon that I'd just seen in Central Park, and it said, "If you capture this Pokemon, bring him in, and we'll reward you with one free ice cream for every ice cream you buy." And I thought, wow, but what is the greater intention or application of this? And I thought, snitching and posses, they threw a Pokemon in there and they offer a reward, an ice cream for this Pokemon. They could just as easily take that technology, which we know they now do, put the picture of a person, guilty or innocent, offer a reward for that person, and instantly you're going to have 100 million people as your detectives, as your surrogates, trying to get that person for whatever reason, right or wrong. Right? Amber Alerts, for example, that's a good reason. But I'm sure that they could put out a dragnet for innocent people that they want to drag in. So I'm very suspicious of it, and I'm very critical of the snitch society. The snitch society is defined by East Germany.
But back to your point about these electronic devices hijacking consciousness, I agree, and I see also there are some plus sides to some of this technology, but it seems like the social discipline is weak. It's our weakness as a society seems to be towards the things that don't really, we don't seem to have the discipline to stay away from it. Now people are trying to get away from the technology. There is a move of a lot of people are starting to understand just how insidious this is. And now you've got coming on the scene this augmented reality stuff, 3D imagery, 3D. You can now visit homes. The Google Street Maps now has a new feature where you can actually record a virtual tour inside your home. So people can literally go to an address in real estate and do a virtual tour. So all this virtualization, it's all just as insidious, I think. It has some good sides, but I'm wondering if maybe the downsides are going to outweigh it.
I want to give you an example of how this technology can hijack not only your awareness, but your body itself. I went to see Prometheus in 3D, and it's fantastic technology. And it wasn't uncommon for me to look around the theater and see people reaching out with their hands to see if they could touch some object. But the thing that got me was in that scene where they are destroying the tree of life and all the missiles are flying, all of a sudden a missile came out of that screen and it was coming directly at me. And I'm telling you, I love Tai Chi.
Oh, I think you're talking about Avatar, not Prometheus, but Avatar.
Oh, yes, Avatar.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But Avatar, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's all right.
Those are the two 3D movies that I've seen. But yes, it was Avatar. So in the middle of this horrible destruction of the Tree of Life, this missile flies out of the screen, and I dodged it. It came right at me, and I slid my shoulders and my head out of the way, and I heard the woman behind me scream. I said, I dodged it, and it hit her. She didn't move. So she screamed as if she'd been hit by the missile. But man, I'm telling you, this illusion took over my brain and my nervous system and took over my Tai Chi reflexes and saved my life, figuratively speaking. I'm very proud of that.
Well, it
that
is
I
a great
got.
example of how we can be manipulated through imagery.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
I had no control of it. I had no control of my muscles because that's what Tai Chi does. It teaches you how to be aware, conscious of any danger, any threat to your body, and instantaneously react without my ego. You know,
And,
my ego was involved in the illusion,
and we
but
would be naive to think
my
that this
soul
isn't being
perceived the threat.
militarized. We would
Say again, please.
we would be naive to think this isn't being militarized because they have what they call voice of God technology. They have
Yes.
all these
Yeah.
different sound-based and electromagnetic-based technologies to put ideas in people's heads. So why wouldn't they even convert that now into visual imagery? How would you know what's reality anymore,
Hmm. Well,
or
that
what we think is
that stands
reality?
out.
Right?
That stands out as one of the most significant experiences of how this technology can make you do things that your will is not in, your conscious will is not intended. My subconscious will, which is the will to survive, the will to save my life, and I'd like to talk a little bit about what that faculty was. That faculty, I have given a name to it. I call it the master of the house. The master of the house never sleeps. When your ego goes to sleep, the master of the house is awake, monitoring your heartbeat, monitoring your blood flow, your blood pressure, your metabolism, and the instant that any danger approaches, the master of the house wakes you up and brings you into the reality to defend yourself. One example I have is I had a Tai Chi student many, many years ago. This is going back to 1977. He trained in Tai Chi and he trained in Kung Fu with me. And then he called me up one day and he said, "Robert, you won't believe what happened to me." I said, "What happened?" He says, "I'm sleeping in my bed in the middle of the night in black sleep. I'm not dreaming. And all of a sudden I woke up and I was standing in the bed stark naked with a machete in my hand." I said, "What?" He says, "Yeah, I woke up and I was standing in my bed and I had a machete in my hand and I looked. And in the darkness, I saw somebody who was trying to break in through the window. And he saw me standing there, stark naked, with a machete in my hand. And he freaked out. He screamed and ran down the fire escape as fast as he could." That's the master of the house. My friend Tom was dead asleep. You know, that's what I call black sleep, no dream sleep. Dead to the world. And bingo, in one flash, his body jumped up before he was awake. His body jumped up, grabbed the sword off the wall, and was standing there. And then his consciousness came to him, and his body was already defending him against this intruder who was halfway through the window.
Mm.
Now, is this master of the house technique something that you guys practiced or taught or was learned, or just something that happened?
Oh, yeah.
I would say I have defined it, but it's something that evolves with the practice of yoga, with Tai Chi, martial arts in general. But I think Tai Chi brings you to the highest level of sensitivity because it's based on softness and sensitivity rather than in brutality, brute force, or speed. Tai Chi teaches you how to use whatever energy is directed against you and to make a U-turn in through you and return to the source. So
Isn't that also Aikido? Isn't that also?
Aikido is based on the same principles. Yeah. Aikido evolved from a Japanese master who went to China and saw Tai Chi, but because he was Japanese, he would not be taught. And so he took as much as he could from the what he saw in the philosophical principles of it, and he developed Aikido. I'm told that this master, Shiba, was quite a man. You know, he got involved in, you know, there was a warlord period over there in China. And Japanese people were not really favored there. And so I heard that he got thrown into a pit with a tiger. And they were waiting for him to get eaten by the tiger. And he defended himself against the tiger with his karate and was able to defeat the tiger and survive. So he took this essential principle. I think a tiger will teach you Tai Chi really fast, honestly. The legend of the origins of Tai Chi have to do with this legendary figure, John Sun Feng, who is said to have lived on a mountain that was infested by tigers, and so he had to learn self-defense against tigers. And there are certain moves in the Tai Chi form that's, for example, embrace the tiger, return to mountain.
Mm-hmm.
That comes from John Sun Feng going home. Embrace the tiger, return to mountain. And there's another one called step back and ride the tiger. So right there, it tells you two things that you can do to save yourself from a tiger eating you. One is step back and ride the tiger, mount him. And there are depictions of famous depictions in Chinese culture of a little boy riding a tiger with his legs wrapped around his neck and not letting go. But the way that Chan Sun Feng used to deal with tigers is that he waited for the tiger to leap. Then he would sidestep it and grab the two rear ankles of the tiger and twist them and slam the tiger into the ground and break his back. So that's how Tai Chi evolved, a very practical survival technique against tigers, wild animals, and brigands.
Yeah, and that's how many of the martial arts also teach you how to deal with attacking dogs. You get a hold of one of the limbs and you twist it around and then lift them over and slam them down and kill them.
Yeah, well, I would never want to kill an animal, but I have persuaded animals to cease and desist attacking me or harassing me. One of them was a dog that was coming at me, and I just swept with my foot. I swept his two forepaws, two front legs. I swept him and sent him rolling like a little barrel. He went away. And then, this is recently, earlier in the year, I was walking down a hill on my way to my Tai Chi classes in the park, and all of a sudden I see this big hound racing at me, barking, and I felt him coming, and I just turned around and reached out with my hand and said, "Whoa!" When I said, "Whoa," the dogs just stopped, and he rolled over 3 times on his side. His master never touched him. It was just the sound that came out of my mouth, and my direct look at him and my gesture with my hand. It was like sweeping with my hand and saying, "Whoa!" And the sweep and the sound rotated the dog 2 times, and he just stopped and went back the other way.
Yeah.
Nonviolent. Another time I was playing Frisbee. I jumped over a wall and went to pick up a Frisbee, and a German Shepherd attacked me. And instantly my arm just raised. I said just raised, right? I didn't say I raised my arm. That's again the master of the house. My consciousness was concentrating on that white Frisbee that was on the ground, and I was reaching with my left arm, and all of a sudden this full-grown German Shepherd attacked to bite me, and my arm rose about 3 inches, and my forearm, the radius and the ulna, those 2 bones in my forearm, caught him right across the snout. And I tell you, it was painful for that dog, because all of the hostility and the menace and in the attack, when his snout touched that bony part of my arm, I like to call it my Napoleon part, my bony part, it hit, and the dog squealed in pain and ran away. And I didn't do it. The master of the house did it.
Yeah.
And again, I thank my lucky stars to have learned Tai Chi from the age of 22. So
we have covered consciousness really well here. There's one more subject that I want you to touch on briefly before we are done with the interview, and that is, you mentioned before the show that you had some information about what's on the moon, who's there, and maybe we haven't been told the whole truth about it. There's an atmosphere up there, and we have all kinds of artifacts and different that we have NASA prints and private prints of things up there. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the moon for us.
Yes. People are becoming aware of a lecture that I did in San Francisco in 2014 at the Secret Space Program and Breakaway Civilization Conference.
Yeah, I
And
see
I
that.
I presented Who's Minding the Moon, the revelations of Apollo. And what I found in many Apollo photographs are UFOs and alien artifacts that are on the moon and that have been suppressed. And they've been suppressed even from the memories of the people who took the pictures. The most significant one, an example, is Apollo 14, Edgar Mitchell. I met Edgar Mitchell 2 days after the Columbia, 2 days before the Columbia crashed, the space shuttle.
Yeah.
And I shook hands with him and conversed with him. And I asked him a question that revealed to everyone present that Edgar Mitchell, as affable, as open as he thought he was still under very strict mind control. And it came about that I was in the second row, right up there in front, and he was being a very affable, philosophical professor, a super consciousness astronaut who had an epiphany on the way back from the moon. So I decided to ask him something about a certain crater called Ukurt that's in the center of the moon. And since 1953, periodically a red ruby light has been seen to come out of it. And when the moon is full and the sun is shining directly into the crater, a six-pointed star, like Star of David, is illuminated with the points on the circumference to form the star. And I was curious about that crater because up to that time, NASA was not releasing entire pictures of the crater. You'd show 2/3 of the crater, 1/4 of the crater, half of the crater, but never the whole crater. So I was curious about it, and I knew from studying the flight path and the landing that they landed quite near it and had to overfly it on the way down. So I raised my hand, and he looks at me, he acknowledges, he says, "Hi, what's your question?" Very nice, friendly fellow. And I said, "I feel very privileged to be speaking to you, Captain Mitchell. You have one of the 12 eyeballs, human eyeballs, that have really seen the moon. So I would like to ask you, could you describe for me the internal structure of the crater Ukurt?" And at the moment I said that, he snapped his body rigidly into attention. He clicked his heels. He put his hands at his side as if he was at attention. He glared at me and he said, "No." And everybody jumped, because just as my reaction with the dog, when the dog attacked me, I was unconscious of my reaction.
Yeah.
It was obvious he was unconscious of his reaction because it was so out of character. That's the character he had been being up to that moment. He says, "No!" And then he realized that the whole audience, 200 people or more, had seen his reaction.
Wow.
And he said these words to me. He said to me, "That was not in the mission profile, so I don't have to answer that." And what do you say to that? I mean,
well, it's obvious he was covered.
That's a really weird answer, isn't it?
I've heard that all the astronauts went through rigorous blank slating procedures.
2 weeks. 2 weeks before any of them were allowed to see us. Remember, they were taken on the aircraft carrier and put in basically into a bus without wheels, the quarantine unit. And then they were taken back and either lifted off with a crane or flown back under a Chinook helicopter. But nobody would see them for 2 weeks. And 2 weeks later, they would have press conferences, and they would appear very depressed and very taciturn and unwilling to answer questions, simple questions like, "Can you see the stars on the moon? Why can't you see stars on the moon?" Blah, 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 like that. So yes, they are all victims of MK Ultra.
I was actually going to ask you about that. Now, I had heard this, and you tell me what your opinion is, that many of the pictures that people that are trying to debunk moon missions, they say, well, the images are faked. You don't see any stars in the background. And what I heard, one of the theories behind this was that the sky had been blanked out because of UFOs in the pictures.
True. As a matter of fact, one of the unique elements of my lecture in 2014 in San Francisco, Secret Space Program, was that I found photographs Apollo high-resolution photographs that did show stars, and that was the first thing that caught me. I have this instinct for research. As I said, God moves the mouse, I just click it. When I clicked this, I saw these giant, beautiful, high-resolution photographs taken by Apollo 17. And there were stars in the background. I said, wow, these are rare. I've never seen an Apollo photograph with stars in the background. So I start studying one, and I downloaded a whole stream of them. I start going from one to another to another. And as the photographs were taken on the far side of the moon, I started to see space stations, starships. As a matter of fact, I have one that proves to me that the Starship Enterprise was leaked to Gene Roddenberry from one of the Apollo 17 photographs. I found a spacecraft on the other side of the moon, a space station or a starship, and it had that structure of the two arms and the two propulsion units with the dilithium crystals, etc. And I feel that the Starship Enterprise was modeled on that. But the most important thing I discovered was a tower scores of miles high that I dubbed Big Ben on the moon. And I would appreciate it if you Google Big Ben on the moon, because I put it on the internet. You'll be able to put that photograph into this documentary. It'll be very easy, or I can send it to you. And this photograph shows a tower on the horizon, tilted, leaning back a little bit, because it's so far away that it's beyond the horizon. And the horizon is blocking the base. Because the moon is so much smaller than the Earth, things fall away more rapidly than they do on the Earth. I'm very proud of having discovered that, and I called it Big Ben on the Moon. So anyone listening can Google Big Ben on the Moon and Robert Morningstar, and you'll see it. It's a series of studies. So the far side of the moon has the remains of ancient civilizations, devastated areas that I dubbed them Hiroshima on the moon, because that's exactly what they reminded me of. And they showed what boils down to a city on the far side of the moon that looks utterly devastated by nuclear holocaust. Which
Corey
is
Goode alludes to these same accounts in his accounts of massive remains of wars and destruction on the moon.
Yeah. I never heard him speak about the moon. I've heard him speak about Mars, but it brings us to the subject of the Martian cataclysm and John Brandenburg's discovery that Mars shows signs of a vast and huge nuclear holocaust, because the readings by satellites of the chemical composition of the surface of Mars shows xenon-29.
Exactly. Yeah, this is
spread all over the moon, which is a radioactive isotope that is only produced by nuclear explosions. So that would give some weight to the theory that there was an interplanetary war eons ago that involved Mars and the planet that some people call Marduk. Mars and Marduk had a war, and Marduk was destroyed, just like we saw the planet destroyed in Star Wars.
That gives us the asteroid belt.
Right, that's what gives us the asteroid belt.
I think this is also outlined in the Law of One. They talk about this.
Yes. Well, I think that it's clear, and I have the feeling that many of us here on Earth are carrying Martian bloodlines, and that the Martians came to Earth. They were far superior to the proto-hominid or the early monkey man that was around. And the survivors of the Martian cataclysm came to Earth and realized that there were too few of them to propagate and to survive as the pure Martian race. But knowing that their genes were superior and dominant, they chose to have intercourse with the proto-hominid, expecting that in a period of time, several thousand years, that the dominant Martian genome would express itself and a hybrid Martian Martian hominid would evolve on this planet.
I heard this other theory too, Robert, about that. That one
Yeah.
of the reasons why, like if you look at a dog or a cat on this planet or any animal, when you look at them, they look, a dog, he's physically fit. He doesn't have to work out. Cats, they can, cats and animals and monkeys and whatnot, everything except humanity has to work out to achieve a really physically fit body. You've really got to work at it. And I heard that one of the reasons is because the bodies that we have, the DNA, was really designed for a lighter gravity, which would correspond with what we would have had on Mars.
Oh, yes. You are echoing the wisdom of my grandfather. Back in 1976, he said to me, Robert, humanity doesn't belong on this planet. It's not made for this planet. And I said, what do you mean, Grandpa? He said, well, look at the dog, look at the cat, look at the bear, look at the animals of Earth. They're all fit for Earth. They have fur, they have claws to defend themselves. They are in their natural habitat. But look at mankind. Man is naked. He has no fur. He has no protection against the environment. He has to work really hard to create clothing to protect him. He has to work really hard to find food or to farm. And he said, man came from another world where it wasn't as hostile as Earth is, and man is still adapting to this planet. And I think you're echoing his insight.
It wasn't just mine either. I believe there was a scientist. This was 5-6 years ago. I read about this. There was actually a scientist that said, based on the physiology of the human body, it really wasn't designed for this planet. It was because of all the back problems people have, the amount of effort it takes to really get into shape, to really look like the incredible V-shaped body for men, and to really be in shape. We really have to work hard, and it takes so little for us to be beaten down by this planet. So he was saying that that we're obviously not, our genetics are obviously not from this planet, which could be a good theory.
I remember that article, but I think it's only partly true. I think that a great part of the difficulty that humanity has in dealing with life on this planet has to do with a distorted self-image. And this is the thing that Tai Chi corrects. Tai Chi corrects your skeleton geometrically. It teaches you what I call the blueprint for the human being. And it teaches you what I call Adam's walk. When Adam woke up in the garden that first morning, he felt great. He was in perfect shape, perfect consciousness. But his self-image became distorted through the process of the fall in the garden, which I believe, let me tell you what I believe about the fall and how our images became distorted and how our DNA was damaged. The story of the fall of Adam and Eve has to do with the tree of life and the forbidden fruit. And obviously now, almost everyone is accepting this idea that Eve had sex with the serpent, and she conceived Cain, and he was stronger, more powerful, and also more aggressive, hostile. He had a murderous instinct, a reptilian instinct. But I said, and as a result of her giving to Adam of the fruit to eat, Adam choked, and supposedly that's the source of the Adam's apple. You know that legend of the Adam's apple? He was choked on the apple. Well, every myth has an element of truth in it. It's a simple story intended to convey a greater truth, and so that as time goes by, it is not going to be distorted very much because of its simplicity. Now, I was contemplating this idea of Adam's loss of immortality because of the fall, or the sin. So what was his sin? First sin was he lied to God. He hid from him. And the second sin was that even he had eaten the forbidden fruit. But I said to myself, I don't think that lying or eating an apple would be enough to deprive a human being of his immortality. Something else had to happen. Now, why do we die? Because our DNA degenerates. The telomeres get frayed and deteriorate, and so each replication of the cell is being replicated from a more and more degraded DNA. So how did this happen? And I said to myself, you know what happened? Eve had sex with a reptilian serpent man, and she contracted a venereal disease. And this venereal disease was transferred to Adam symbolically. Eating the apple was having sex. So she transferred this alien virus, which I call the serpent virus or the snake flu, and transferred it to Adam. And so Adam, when he awoke the day after eating the apple, he realized, man, I'm sick. I'm not right. Something happened. And this caused an alteration in his DNA, but also in his self-image. Shame came into his life. Conscience was expressed. You see, conscience is a God-given faculty that lets you know, right? It lets you know what's right and wrong. Mm-hmm. But up to that point, Adam had not experienced or done anything wrong. But when he disobeyed and he ate the apple and contracted this snake flu, he realized that he had done something wrong. His conscience sprung up, and the shame and the guilt led him to try to lie, hide, cover up his nakedness. Right? He learned that to be ashamed of his nakedness, whereas before he lived in a beautiful paradisical garden and shameless to be naked all the time and to partake of the fruits of the world. So I believe that we inherited a defect from the serpent, and it was intentional. I think it was biological warfare against humanity. And that biological warfare was to demean us, to degrade us, to deprive us of our true God-given self-image, and that the distortion of that self-image has led to decrepitude and accelerated aging. Mm-hmm. Because our bones are in the wrong places in our bodies, our organs are not in correct relationships with them. Mm-hmm. And when you study Tai Chi and reconstruct yourself, because that's what Tai Chi requires, assuming these postures and obeying the principles of balance in the human body. For example,
it brings you back into alignment, is what you're
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Right. It is really no different than taking an old Ironsides. When I was a little boy in the 6th grade to 8th grade in Catholic schools, they had a collection every week to rebuild old Ironsides, which was a really old wrecked sailing ship from Revolutionary War. And we had to give pennies and go on collections, and lo and behold, let me see, 30 years after those pennies flowed, I saw a documentary, and Old Ironsides is now the oldest commissioned ship in the U.S. Navy. It's afloat. It sails from Boston. It's got a captain and a Navy crew. And what they did is they took Old Ironside and put it into dry dock, and they laid down a big, long plank, and they brought it on and laid the keel on that plank, and they took out the water, and the ship settled on the plank, and so they straightened out its keel. When the keel was straightened out, all the ribs started to migrate into their correct and original positions, and the ship was repaired, and the ship is sailing today. Wow. Old Ironsides, USS Constitution. And I use that analogy for what the human body undergoes when you study Tai Chi. That's why I say that what I teach is the blueprint for the human being, the blueprint for the form of Adam, and it teaches you that locomotion is based on harnessing gravity to be the propulsive force and muscles to be the steering. Unfortunately, when you have an adversarial relationship with gravity, you can't relax, because if you relax, you'd fall on your face or fall on your A.
True.
Right? But the body in perfect alignment, the skeleton is an organ, a weight-bearing organ in the human body. And when you are aligned properly, gravity is conducted through your body correctly. It starts to rebuild you and heal you and it becomes the locomotive force, and it's a very spiritual force. Ida Rolf, who developed Rolfing, said gravity is the healer. I say also gravity is the destroyer.
It's
Because
true.
as your bones are in the wrong position, the force of gravity is pulling them into ever more wrong positions, and the reaction is to rigidify your musculature to substitute the rigidity of the muscle for the natural structural support of the skeleton.
Robert,
So, yeah.
this has been a fascinating discussion. We're coming up on a closing time. Is there a website or internet resources people can learn more about you and what you're doing and what's going on in your world?
Sure, you can read my writings on UFOs and the paranormal in UFO Digest, ufodigest.com. Also, there are films and documentaries on YouTube. With regard to the JFK assassination, I would like to point the audience to a YouTube called Warning, The Ultimate Secrets of the JFK Assassination Part 1. The key word is warning, because there are a million JFK
Now,
videos.
you're based out of New York City, and you also have your own broadcast as well. You've got your own show that you do on a regular basis,
Yeah.
don't you?
Yes, I do. I have two shows. I have one on Revolution Radio on Sundays at 3 o'clock, and this Sunday I'm going to have Walter Bosley, former U.S. Air Force, I think he's a technical sergeant
That's
who was
great,
in all the
Robert.
UFOs. And on Wednesdays I'm on L&M, Late Night in the Midlands at 9 o'clock, and I have the Morningstar Report with my co-host Scott Teeters.
Oh, that's great. Well, Robert, this has been another fascinating discussion with you. You are just a font of unlimited. You're one of the best storytellers I know.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
God
absolutely.
gave me a gift, and I try to use it for the good of mankind.
So,
Yeah, you sure have done that.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Robert. And with that, I guess we're going to end the show. And everybody, check out Robert's websites, his resources. Check out his show on lnmradionetwork.com. He's on Wednesday
Facebook.
nights.
Don't forget Facebook.
That's right.
Please. Yeah,
Yes.
I forgot about that.
As
That's
our
where you
good
feel
friend,
see my news stream there.
as our good friend Jaffe calls it, the Kraken. Yes. So,
That's a good one.
alrighty then.
And don't forget YouTube. You are all over YouTube.
Yes.
There's some phenomenal shows out there.
Absolutely. Robert is everywhere. And thank you for taking the time again with us today. And with that, we will say goodbye and definitely check out Robert's resources. So until next episode, another episode of Broadcast Team Alpha comes to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you.